Welcome, everybody. We'll get started. I just want to say a few quick words to introduce tonight's third lecture by Danny Kahneman in the MBB series. As in the previous two nights, Danny will give a lecture for approximately 55 minutes or so. And then we'll end tonight with a commentary by Dan Gilbert from the psychology department. Danny will then give a couple of comments in response, and then we'll leave some time for some questions. I just want to say briefly that we've, I think, been treated to something quite terrific, and I think it's terrific in three ways. It's been a story that's been building up over 2 days, which we'll kind of end on in some sense tonight. It's a great story from a great scientist, and that's always lovely to hear. So that's the first point. The second, I think, it's a great message to all of us in some sense about how at least to try to do good science that we can aspire to. And third, I think it sends a very nice message. Danny started off his talk, the first talk, by showing a slide of Amos Tversky in a very relaxed, happy pose. But what I've gotten out of tonight, the two talks so far, is that Danny is equally relaxed and enjoying himself doing the science. And I think it's important to keep that in mind as we struggle to get grants and get papers rejected, that there's a lot of fun involved in doing the science. So without further ado, we're going to end on a happy note tonight. This is the work that Danny has been really heavily involved in recently, and it will be followed up by a talk by Dan Gilbert.
Okay. That's my outline, and I'll indicate when I get from one point to the other so that it encourages me and you to know that, the end is approaching. So let me begin with describing my set of collaborators that I've had over the last few years. And the empirical work that I'll be talking about is largely drawn from... This should not be on, I think. Okay. The empirical work that I'll be describing is, well, there have been two collaborations, one on studies of what I call the day reconstruction method, and my collaborator there are the economist Alan Kruger and my psychologist friends David Schkade, Arthur Stone, and Norbert Schwartz, also a French sociologist, Claude Fischler, and Talia Miron-Schatz, who is my postdoc. And what we did there, we studied one day in the lives of several thousand women in 3 countries, what they did during that day and what their feelings were. And I won't be showing you a lot of slides about that, but it will come up in, when I describe what I think I know about well-being, data from there will come up. More recently, I've been involved with the Gallup organization, which is running a world poll. It already has about 250,000 respondents in about 130 countries. I know the results of the first wave, and I'll be talking about those. They are also running a daily poll. And the daily poll is something that they started January 1st. They're sampling 1,000 people every day. And so they have about 100,000 now. I'll be talking about data from the first 50,000 or so. And there they're asking two questions. The ladder of life, which I'll call a measure of life evaluation. And please imagine a ladder with steps numbered from 0 at the bottom to 10 at the top. The top of the ladder represents the best possible life for you, and the bottom of the ladder represents the worst possible life for you. On which step of the ladder would you say you personally feel you stand at this time? This has been asked all over the world. The question is not new. It's known as the Cantrill question. I think it was introduced in the 1950s, and it's been used periodically since. And I think it's a beautiful question. You really can learn a lot from it. And then, largely, actually under my influence, I think, Gallup added questions about affect. And affect had been studied in that context by Norman Bradburn and others many, many years ago, about 40 years ago. But the Gallup Daily Poll and the Gallup World Poll, both have some questions about your affective experience yesterday, and I'll talk about that. And that's measured by this question. Now, let me go to my first topic, the deconstruction of utility, with a bit, actually, of personal history about how I came to that topic. And I became interested a few decades ago. I became interested in a distinction that I think is sort of neglected in economics, and that is a distinction between two meanings of a term that is used all the time, and the term is utility. And there are really two quite different ways in which this term is used. In economics, it is used as a synonym for wantability. That term is not mine. I think Fisher had it, the economist Fisher had it in 1918. He said that's what utility is. And that is the standard usage. This is the weight of an outcome in the process of decision. But Bentham had a completely different notion. For Bentham, it was hedonic experience. Those were pain and pleasure, the two sovereign masters that govern us. And that, I think, is still standard usage in philosophy, and it is completely different. And so there we have those two meanings, and why the distinction was ignored in economics until very recently is sort of interesting. I think it has in part to do with the behavioristic bent that economics adopted at the beginning of the 20th century, and it also has something to do with the rational agent model, that is, with the idea that people are rational agents, because if they are rational agents and you know what they want or you know what they decide, you don't have to ask in addition what's good for them or whether they enjoy it, because they are choosing what's good for them. So in the context of the rational agent model, there isn't much need to measure separately what people want and what they enjoy. So I think that the renewed interest, and David Leibson in the first day really spoke about that something is happening in economics. They're getting quite interested in happiness, not all economists, but a small minority of economists. And it is true that every year at APA there is something going on about economics, at not APA, EA, the American Economic Association, and it's been standing room only for several years. So clearly this is attracting attention. Now, there is a third term, predicted utility, I introduced, and this is just, it's what utility you expect to get. And this is different from the utility, from what you want, and it's different from what you actually experience, and basically it's an inferior term for Dan Gilbert's affective forecasting. And you just, when somebody has the same term and it's a better term for an idea you've had, forget it. I mean, don't try to. This is affective forecasting. Now, let me introduce some of these distinctions and actually deconstruct the notion of experience utility a bit further. And I'm going to describe a study that anyone who's heard me talk about for the last 15 years or so has seen those. I'm known as the person who studies colonoscopies. So patients undergoing colonoscopy reported their pain every 60 seconds. And those are records of two patients, patient A and patient B. And 10 is intolerable pain and 0 is zero pain. For people who are much younger than I am and cannot remember painful colonoscopies because now they're typically done under general anesthesia. When the study was done, it was very light or no anesthesia, and it was quite painful, as it was for both patient A and for patient B. Now, every minute they recorded their pain. And now we can ask the question, how much did these patients suffer? And I'm asking you. So you now adopt the perspective of an objective observer, and I think there is no question in your minds that, one of these guys they were men, had a worse experience than the other, and that patient B had a worse experience than patient A. Because indeed, when you look at that, at every level of pain, patient B had as much pain as patient A, if you take, if they use the scale similarly, which I'm assuming, and some more. So this is a case of dominance. Now, what you do here, you look at the profile of what I call moment utility. So those are utilities. Utility, and that's very clear from Bentham's treatment, is a cut through time. And then you can extend it. But like brightness, which is a cut through time, it's a cut of experience, or loudness, it's at a moment. There is utility at a moment. And now you can draw a graph. And the economist Francis Edgeworth famously invented a hedonimeter in a book that he published, I think, in 1869. And this basically is what a hedonimeter looks like. And Edgeworth proposed that the area under the curve would be a measure of happiness. And basically quite a few of us now are in one way or another following Edgeworth's idea, Edgeworth's problem. Now, whoops, things are not going well in my control of my slides. Oh, come on. Ah, no, this is not. There is another question that you can ask, and that one has to do with the remembered utility of the episode. So I spoke of moment utility, that's what the person reports at any instant. The remembered utility is something that you measure later. It's how much did these patients think that they suffered? And that question is asked from the subjective perspective of, the sufferer, the person who undergoes the patient. And it's a retrospective perspective, and it's a global evaluation. So it's a global retrospective assessment of an episode. And what makes this interesting is that those two assessments, your objective view of who suffered more, and the patient's subjective experience of how much they suffered, do not agree. So what actually happens on this graph is patient A reported substantially more pain than patient B, and that is not an accident, that's a very general rule. And the reason is that for patient A, the episode ended at a point of high, severe pain. For patient B, the pain at the end was much lower. And there is a rule, and it's quite straightforward what the rule is. If you want to predict how people will evaluate an episode, such as an episode of colonoscopy, then what you take is you look at the peak pain that people reported, you look at the pain that they reported in the last minute or two, you take the average of that, and you end up with a correlation that is really quite remarkable, considering the amount of noise there is in the system. And there is one variable that is completely ignored. So you get what I've called the peak and end rule, which is averaging, it's a weighted average of two particular moments. And there is a variable that's missing. The duration of the procedure seems to have no effect whatsoever in these two judgments, and that is a general rule. That, we've had some data now on about 800 patients who've gone through that kind of procedure, and the correlation is stubbornly zero, and there is a lot of variability in the duration of colonoscopies. I mean, in that first study, I think it went from 4 minutes to 1 hour and 7 minutes. So, there is a big range. But when people remember the episode, they think of the episode as a moment. I spoke about that in my first lecture for those of you who were here, when I was speaking of representation by prototypes. That there is a rule that is more general than the representativeness principle, and that just as we think of bank tellers, of feminist bank tellers, it's a category and we represent it by a prototype, you can think of an episode as a set of moments, and people create and represent that set by a representative moment. And once you do that, what is called the extension of the set is lost. That is, information about the quantitative aspect, how many bank tellers there are, or how long the episode was, disappear if you operate on that representation. Now, people are fully aware of the duration. It's not that they don't know how long it lasted. They have that information. But when you ask them, how bad was it? It doesn't call up the duration. It calls up an average of the peak and the end. And sometimes they realize that they made a mistake in doing that, because you can make people choose. And that's an experiment, the next experiment that I'll talk about. You can cause people to violate dominance. And here again, those who were here at the first lecture, I said that those evaluations by prototype produce characteristically violations of dominance. And there was that example of Linda, if you remember her, who was more likely, so people thought, to be a feminist bank teller than to be a bank teller. And you get exactly the same thing in those episodes. So here is an experiment. On 2 trials separated by 7 minutes, participants immerse a hand in cold water until instructed to remove their hand. 7 minutes after the second trial, they are called for a third trial and are asked which of the 2 trials they want to repeat. So they've had 2 experiences, one with each hand. One is short, and that means immersing your hand in a bucket of water for 60 seconds, and the water is at 14 degrees Celsius, which is tolerable but quite painful, and the pain builds up. The long experience is just the same as the short for the first 60 seconds, but then instead of being required to take your hand off and being given a warm towel, you're told nothing. But the experimenter turns on a valve that allows some slightly warmer water to flow in, so that over the next 30 seconds, the temperature rises from 14 degrees to 15 degrees. And now, depending on how you count it, for the people who recorded, people also recorded every second the pain that they experienced. For the people who reported a drop in the pain, 80% of them preferred the long to the short. So they exposed themselves to 30 seconds of needless discomfort because that's what they remember. They find the longer episode in memory less aversive than the short episode, and so they choose by the one they dislike less. And that's not an isolated finding. It's been replicated in diverse domains, and this is quite a solid result. Okay, so that brings me to a way that I've been speaking about that kind of thing recently, especially since my interest shifted from episodes to the study of well-being. And I've been thinking in terms of 2 selves. And one is the experiencing self. So when I ask you, how much pain do you feel right now? I'm addressing this to your experiencing self. Now, psychologists have different ways of measuring, the duration of the present, of the psychological present. And, they vary depending on how you do it. But a fairly common estimate is about 3 seconds. Now, what 3 seconds mean is that there are 20,000 episodes like that a day, and that in a 70-year life, there are about 100 million of them. And so those are present moments, and now each of these moments is extraordinarily rich. Most of them are. I mean, not all of them, but quite a few of them are really quite rich. We're trying to do something, there is an action going on, there is mental content, there are thoughts, there are goals, there are emotions. And all of these could be characterized, they characterize the moment of experience. And now you can ask, what happens to those moments? And of course, what happens is most of them vanish without a trace. They're gone. We go through time in that way. And it's a succession of experiencing selves. Now, the remembering self is quite a different beast. The remembering self is the one that you ask, how was your colonoscopy? How was your vacation? Did it hurt? And the remembering self takes a retrospective perspective on things and integrates over time. That is, you could also ask specific point questions, but in my usage, mostly, it's a global evaluation that we're talking about. And so the remembering self is the one who keeps score. And it's sort of interesting how that is done, because the score appears not to be kept continuously, but it's when the scene changes, when there is a transition from one state to another state, a score is generated. And whenever you require people to make an evaluation or you change the situation, they have a score. Now, it turns out that we have those 2 cells, and that has serious implications for the study of well-being, because to the extent that those 2 cells do not agree, and they do not agree, I can tell you, otherwise I wouldn't be telling you this story. To the extent that they do not agree, we are going to have a normative problem. We are going to have to decide which of them is more important, and it's not going to be easy. In fact, I have no idea how to do it, but that's what we're going to be talking about. Now, I want to make a few general observations about these two cells. First of all, there is a way in which the remembering self is completely dominant. Because when we think about our lives, it's the only perspective we can take. The experiencing self just cannot operate in that way. And so whenever you think about what is happening to you, about what you're trying to do, about your life in general, it's the remembering self who is doing that. And now, if the remembering self really doesn't know exactly what happened to the experiencing self, or is making systematic mistakes, then there is no guarantee that the remembering self in its evaluations or in its decisions is going to serve the best interest of the experiencing self. And that's what I was trying to demonstrate with the colonoscopy example, that one patient clearly had more pain than the other, but the remembering selves of these two patients had different opinions. Now, what I want to draw out is that the experiencing self really doesn't have a voice. And if a remembering self is wrong, there is no recourse to the extent that, and it's the remembering self that makes the decisions. And we know that from a lot of research. Ed Diener has done some research on vacations, where people maintain a diary, then they write a summary evaluation of what it was like, and then they later are asked whether they'd like to repeat that vacation. And really, the diary doesn't matter. It's how they scored it later that predicts whether they want to repeat it. And in some cases, the dissociations are quite substantial. So people choose to repeat something because they have a memory. The memory is not accurate, but it's the remembering self that made the choices. Now, I want to talk a bit about another metaphor. You know, I mean, when you work with those things for years, you develop favorite metaphors. I think it is true that all of us, throughout our lives, maintain a sort of narrative of our life. And it's a narrative that we really care about a lot. That is, when we think about our lives, we think about our lives as a story. And we want that story to be a good story. And it is a characteristic of stories, actually. Duration neglect is a characteristic of stories. And it's a characteristic of narratives. Narratives are about events, they're about transitions, they're about goals, they're about obstacles, but they're really not about time. And I'll take a minute to, when I was working on this, I think we went to see La Traviata, and in that opera, so you have that young woman who has, through glorious, unselfish action, given up her lover, and because, for snobbish reasons of the father who made her do it. And now she's dying. She is dying of TB, and it's the last act. And, some of us have seen that many times. But now the father is there basically begging her forgiveness, and the son, her ex-lover, is on his way, having learned the truth that she did not really reject him, but that she was made to do so. And you don't really know whether he's going to make it, because she's obviously in a very bad way. And of course she does make it. He does make it. So he comes and she sings and gloriously for 10 minutes, and then she dies. And the point of that story is how much we care that he should make it. We know that it's the fifth act, it's not going to last very long. We really care that it should, that story should end in that particular way. And I remember being struck by the fact, when I was thinking about this, that if I'd been told, if I'd been asked, how old do you think Violetta is? I would have said, I don't know, 28. And then if somebody had told me, no, she's actually 29, so they would have added a whole year to her life, I couldn't care less, really. So it's got nothing to do with time. It is about the story. It is about the quality of the story. And in order to understand what motivates people and, how they think about their life, it's not only, the remembering self with distorted memories. It's the construction of a story that we care about. Now, when I was young and foolish, and that by this I mean about 10 years ago, I believed that only the experiencing self matters. And then Gilbert, whom you'll hear, he still believes that, but he's young. And it's, I no longer believe that you can get away with it. I think the narrative is too important. I think it is almost impossible to maintain a definition of well-being that excludes a motive that guides much of people's lives. If people care about their narrative, how do I decide that it's only their experiences that matter? And the inelegant solution is what I call a hybrid model of well-being. So we're going to have both, because I think that neglecting experiences is also absurd. So we can't neglect the narrative, we can't neglect experience, so we end up with different measures of well-being. One, the evaluation of life, and the other one, experience happiness. And experience happiness is, a duration-weighted average of emotional state, and the other one is, a measure of how people think about the story of their life. Now, we know a fair amount about those because, that's what we've been measuring with the day reconstruction method. We know that the correlation is far from perfect. It's about 0.5. So that if you average the experience over a day and you correlate that with life satisfaction and you correct that for unreliability, and you can get to 0.5, 0.6, you do not get to identity. Those are separate things, how people are. And those two influence each other. I mean, if you're happy with your life, presumably, if you're satisfied with your life, presumably, that tends to put you in a better mood. And certainly if you're in a better mood, you tend to be more satisfied with your life. That's what I represented by those two arrows. And which of those matters when we think about happiness is actually, in very strange ways, context dependent. And it's context dependent, for example, that if I ask the questions, which, as you see, used to be a burning question in my family, are people happier in California? Now, when you ask that question, you don't have in mind, I think, whether people in California are more satisfied with their lives. That's not, or have better stories. You think, are they in a better mood? So there are contexts in which, when we ask that question, we're specifically asking about experience happiness. But, without being aware of it, we interpret the happiness question as life satisfaction in other contexts. So we have those two meanings, and some contexts prime one, some contexts prime the other. We do not sufficiently distinguish them, and one of the tasks that I've taken on in this lecture is to leave you distinguishing between them, because I think it's important to do so. Now, sometimes there are really dramatic conflicts between the experiencing self and the remembering self. And there was a moment, and Dan Ariely, who is, many people know him now because he is the author of the best-selling book called Predictably Irrational. I don't like the word irrational, but the book is a good book. Dan Ariely was burned very severely. And he spent three years in an Israeli military hospital, and he really went through horrors. And he's disfigured. You quickly get very used to it, actually. I mean, he's very charming, and I don't think people mind his appearance. He appeared at a workshop that Dan Gilbert organized, and Dan asked him to speak about his experiences, and he said he would. He agreed to do it. And he did. And that was quite an experience listening to him. He would not speak from the podium. He spoke from the back of the room. And he spoke from the back of the room because he said the last time that he tried speaking about that from the podium, he burst into tears. And then he told us basically that he is a happy man. And there's just no doubt about it. He's an exuberant man. He's a very happy man. And, he's married, he has 2 children, he's written a bestseller, he's got everything, you name it, he's got everything, but he is disfigured. And he occasionally has pain. And he said that he would give years of his life to be like other people. That's a big discrepancy between the experiencing and, something in his evaluation of his life is completely out of kilter with the experiences as he described them himself. Now, this tied up with research that was also presented at Dan's workshop, and which is to appear, is by Peter Ubel and a few other people, and it's about colostomy patients. And colostomy patients, this is worse than a colonoscopy. These are people who have to use a bag. And some people get used to it. In fact, most people get used to it. So when you measure the mood of people who are in a colostomy, who have a colostomy, their mood is normal. In fact, in the research by Ubel and others, I find this astonishing, but in their research, they have lots of data, very good data, they're very serious investigators. The mood of these people is just normal. It's like the controls. Now, how do they differ from the controls? Well, they differ in that they remember their life before the colostomy as gloriously happy. Clearly wrong. They're clearly wrong about their memories. So something is happening. And they are, like Dan Ariely, willing to give up a lot in order to get rid of their colostomy. Now, some people do get rid of their colostomies. That's the beauty of that particular study. So some people actually, colostomy is reversible sometimes. And so you get a population of people who had a colostomy and now they don't. And their mood doesn't improve. It's the same mood. But they remember being astonishingly miserable when they had the colostomy. Now, what is going on? And, well, I have no idea. I really have no idea. I think it's a deep puzzle. I'm struggling with it. I'm sure Peter struggles with it. But how do we put all of this together? And which would you, if you could grant Ariely his wish, would you do it? Knowing that very little would happen to his happiness. He would be 5 years of a happy life shorter, and all he would gain from that is the memory of having been acutely miserable when he was disfigured. This is a very serious problem, and I'm raising it because I have no solution to it. I don't know what we do with this. But it shows the importance, I think, of distinguishing the experiencing self from the remembering self. Now, let me speak about the role of attention. Now, Dan Gilbert and I we have a sort of history of doing the same things together at the same time, and then he publishes them and I don't, or he publishes them with a good name and I don't. And so we started getting interested in predicted utility or affective forecasting actually the same year, I think, in 1984. And we got interested in the role of attention in well-being around the same time. And he is publishing it. Now, I'll talk about the focusing illusion, where I have the better term because he calls it focalism. And, I leave it to you to choose between those two. And I'll talk about the focusing illusion, which is an attention effect. And in order to get at that, I will describe a study that was run by Norbert Schwartz, my colleague, very clever study, I think. And the basic question is that people get asked is, how much pleasure do you get from your car? Now, and then he gets the details of the car, and he looks at the Blue Book value, and he looks at the correlation between how much pleasure people report getting from their car and the Blue Book value of their car. And the correlation is highly significant. I think it's about 0.35. For psychologists, it's good. If there are people here who are not psychologists, this is a good result. Now, he asked people another question. Now, it's not a very clean study, actually, but the general idea is absolutely right. He asked people, think of your commute this morning. How much pleasure did you have during your commute this morning? And correlation is 0 with the Blue Book value of their car, absolute 0. Now, what happens here? And that raises the question, when do you get pleasure from your car? And And the answer is you get pleasure from your car when you think about your car, if it's a good car. So I happen to have a good car. I have a Lexus. I would definitely answer that I get pleasure from my car. And I do get pleasure from it when I think about it. I rarely think about it. And this is basically the story on this. And what happens is that when you ask people how much pleasure you get from your car, they naturally think about their car. But what do they imagine themselves? They imagine themselves in their car thinking about their car. Now, this is where the error comes, because most of the time when they are in their car, they're not thinking about it. They're thinking about lots of other things. But when you ask them the question, they're trapped. It's an epistemological trap. There's nothing they can do about it. They think about themselves thinking about their car. And then if it's a Lexus, it's one thing, and if it's a beaten up something or other, it's something else. And I coined I'm not good with aphorisms, but I'm very proud of this one, which I think would fit it. Actually, it would fit in a Chinese cookie, I think. And this is it. Nothing in life matters quite as much as you think it does while you're thinking about it. That is, just thinking about something makes you exaggerate its importance. And there is no way around this. Because just thinking about an aspect of your life makes you attend to it and makes you think about what it's like when you attend to it. And that's what I call the focusing illusion. Now, it turns out this is really universal, and those results are very similar. What Dan is finding, what we're finding, of course, that the impact bias, we completely agree about the results. I'll just give you a few examples from our research. We had a large sample of people who answered the question, what percentage of your day were you in a good mood or in a bad mood yesterday? So, we have actual data. And then in a related sample, very similar sample, we asked people to predict what percentage of the day are people in a good mood who are in such and such a situation, like an unmarried woman over 40 or something. And household income, below and above, people think 58%, 26%. Now, there is an effect in these data. There is actually an effect of income and mood. But look, people expect 32% difference. The data say 12% difference. I like the difference for a woman over 40 between being alone and being married. We had, by the way, the data are different for young men. Young men think that a woman over 40, forget it. I mean, she must be miserable, regardless of. But this is a true result. But this, we're not segregating young men here. This is overall. Now, the truth is this. So here, people have an idea, and they're focusing on it, and they have their own theory. Now, all of my interest in these problems actually came up from two personal problems of forecasting. And I had a quarrel with my wife about curtains when at some point when we settled in Vancouver. And that's when I became really interested in that problem, because she wanted some curtains that I thought were just absolutely horrible. I mean, we were discussing that recently, and we remembered just the emotion, because up to that point, everything had gone fine, but we'd really furnished the house. But those curtains, and I asked myself quite seriously the question of whether I should go on fighting or give in. And the question was, will I get used to those curtains? Because if I'll get used to them, okay, so there'll be ugly curtains, but I won't mind. And of course I yielded, and 8 years later we sold the house, and you leave the curtains when you sell the house. And one of the things I really missed were the curtains. I had gotten to like them. Now this is a familiar finding. Familiarity brings liking, begets liking. It was a very big effect. I mean, I really liked those curtains at the end. And that got me interested in affective forecasting. I mean, this was really one of the reasons that I got to the problem of affective forecasting. The other one was a debate when we moved from Berkeley to Princeton, my wife wasn't very happy about that move, and the debate centered on whether people are happier in California. And I happen to get money to be able to do a study on that. And what you find is that people are not happier in California, but they think they're happier. And furthermore, people in Ohio or Michigan think that people in California are a lot happier. So there is agreement on something. And now think about California. What happens to you? That's the focusing illusion. California, you think contrast. Contrast means climate. Climate is better. You think of being and enjoying the California climate. That's it. You'll be happy in California. Well, most of the time, people just don't think about the climate. I mean, that's and there are all sorts of complicated effects. Like I must say that these days in Princeton, in bloom, I'm getting more out of the weather in Princeton, than I ever got in California. But those are other complicated effects. But what you have is a massive focusing illusion when you think about this. Now, a basic characteristic of attention is that attention is withdrawn when novelty is lost. So that's one of the things that happen. And that is one of the main mechanisms of adaptation. And here I'm sure we overlap again. So when people adapt to difficult situations or to good situations, one of the things is they stop thinking about them. There are actually three basic situations, three known situations to which people do not adapt. It's chronic pain, constant noise, and depression. They stay bad. And the reason is, in all three cases, something is wrong with attention. I mean, chronic pain is an attention signal. That's what pain is. It's biologically designed to call your attention. Noise is an attention signal. And depression is a situation in which you are trapped. I don't know what is the mechanism, but you're trapped attending to bad thoughts. Now, there are some other observations on attention. It influences affective forecasting, for example, by focusing you on changes. So when you think about, being a paraplegic, say, or what you think about, and we've established that, you think about becoming a paraplegic. That's a very different thing. You're thinking about the change. You're thinking about the transition. This, by the way, for those who had the lecture yesterday, is closely related to prospect theory and to the fact that in prospect theory, the carriers of utility are changes. That's how we represent states. We represent state by the transition to that state. It influences the experiencing self. And there is a difference between American women and French women when it comes to there are many differences, although actually one could exaggerate that. But there is one difference. We studied in the DRM, we asked the day reconstruction method, we asked a sample of women in Rennes, in France, and in Columbus to describe a whole day. And we could get a pretty precise measure of how much time they spent in various activities. And they indicated for each activity, for each episode, what was the activity that was focal, to which they were paying most attention. And we analyzed that. And there we find that French women spent twice as much time attending to food, to eating. But it's not that they spend more time eating. Actually, the American women spend essentially the same amount of time eating, but they are not paying attention to eating. The French women, when they're eating, they know they're eating. The American women are eating while doing all sorts of things. And that, by the way, could be quite important in terms of health consequences. It's also important in terms of enjoyment. I mean, the French women have more fun while they're eating than the American women. The American women have fun eating when they're attending to their eating. But a lot of the time, they're not. Now, it influences the remembering self, of course, and peak and end is an attentional bias, you could say, of what are the singular moments. So, where are we? I've tried to deconstruct utility. I've mentioned two cells. I've talked about the role of attention, and I have saddled you with a large unsolved normative and psychological problem. And now I want to talk about three embarrassing X puzzles I'm going to to describe them. During the past 6 or 7 years, perhaps more than that, I've given lots of talks about well-being. And whenever I gave a talk about well-being, I would present 3 slides as the big puzzles. And I consider them to be X-puzzles. And a lot of that has happened very recently. So I'm telling you, some of it is 2 weeks old. So this is the emblematic result of well-being research. This is socioeconomic, the German socioeconomic panel. People are interviewed once a year. Life satisfaction is on the y-axis. Years is on the left axis. The peak is the year on which they get married. And I leave you to work out the implications of this finding. This is what you get. Obviously a puzzle. Here is another puzzle. It's called the Easterlin paradox. This is what happened in the United States, and with one particular measure of well-being, the percentage of people who say they're very happy over the years, in this case from 1946 to 1996, and GDP per head. That's the Easterlin paradox. Easterlin claimed that basically beyond a certain threshold of income, money no longer matters to happiness. That's what he claims, and that was the demonstration. Americans being beyond that threshold are not benefiting in terms of happiness. That's the Easterlin paradox. And here is a third one. That one is a very famous one. It's a graph of differences among countries in happiness as a function of GDP. And let me tell you how that graph has been read. It has been read, like the Easterlin paradox, as indicating that above a certain number, money doesn't matter. So people have drawn 2 lines, a very steep line up to a certain amount of income and a flat line, and they think that fits. I've spoken about this one, as well as the Easterlin paradox, as a big puzzle. And I'm ashamed of myself, and I'll show you why, because I'll mention some solutions. Let's start with the Easterlin paradox. That's the easiest. This one is just false. It's just not true. When you actually, people have reanalyzed the data, and they've done it extensively, and there is one paper published and another, and 2 others in press all coming out with a conclusion that actually happiness improves with income among the prosperous countries. We have a result. I mean, that's the last 10 days. We looked at the ladder of life at 10 countries where the ladder of life was measured in 1975 and again in 2006. GDP increased in all of them, and the correlation between change in GDP and change in the ladder of life was 0.65, which is significant with 10 countries, but the data are much more massive than that. The Easterlin paradox is not a paradox, it's just not true. And in the US, the ladder of life has improved a lot. There is no generalization. There are some countries where it goes up. The majority of countries, it goes up. In the United States, maybe a little less than others, and that depends, I think, on which variable and which measure you use. It's embarrassing. And what's embarrassing is I think that I wanted to believe in the Easterlin paradox, and so did everybody else. Now, the country differences, that's embarrassing too. Now, does this figure really show that income no longer contributes to happiness beyond some amount? I mean, what do we forget? And I'll tell you what we forget. We forget Weber's law. So we plot it against dollars. Now, do we really expect that an increase of $600 in GDP will have the same effect in Switzerland and in Togo? I mean, that's nonsense. This is theory-induced blindness that I talked about. And this is a collective blindness, and now, I shared it. I spoke about it a lot. Now, this is what happens when you actually plot the data as properly as you should against log units. And if anything, that curve becomes steeper for the rich countries when properly plotted. The correlation between GDP and the average ladder score is 0.84. Over the entire sample, the correlation between individuals' ladder score and the GDP of the country in which they live is 0.44. So if all you know about an individual in the world is the GDP of that of the country of which that individual is a resident, it's 0.44. And there seems to be a universal standard. Oh, by the way, that's never mind. Now, over the entire sample, that's the correlation. There is a universal standard for what a good life is. And Easterlin said that the differences within country are determined by local comparisons. People compare themselves to others. It turns out we've had a good look at that in the last few weeks. It's not true for the latter. We see no evidence. It is true for negative affect. And it is true for negative affect. We have evidence that, so let's put it this way, being richer than others doesn't make you happier, but being poorer than others does make you a little more miserable than you otherwise would be. So that's the finding on that. Let me add to this a result on which is more in the spirit of what we'd like to believe, that materialism is not important. We predict various averages, country averages, from two variables, the GDP of a country and an index of corruption, call that clean government. And the index of corruption is objective. And the two are highly correlated. Over the nations of the world, the correlation between corruption and GDP is, almost minus 0.8. Now you put those two to predict the ladder of life, this is what you get. You predict positive affect and negative affect, and you get a different picture. And there it is as if living in a benign social environment is really very important to positive affect. So that is a promising result. Now I've been cued that, well, I'll take a couple of minutes for the last puzzle. Marriage. What's embarrassing about the marriage puzzle? Well, I'll skip that. What's embarrassing is this. We think that what requires explanation is the drop. We sort of assume, this is really silly, we sort of assume that people are happier when they get married and then they go back. So we want to explain why don't they stay as happy as they were in their best years. That's not the right way to think about it. I mean, actually, it's the peak that is an aberration. So if we thought of explaining why people are so happy while they're about to get married and shortly thereafter, there is a perfectly good attention answer to that. They're thinking about that all the time, and it's a pleasant thought. And then after a while, it stops being novel, and they stop thinking about it. And now there is another reason. It turns out that when you look carefully at what happens, we should compare steady states, is what it says. But when we look carefully at how married women and women who are not married spend their time, the mystery just vanishes. So it's true. I mean, women who are unmarried spend more time alone, and they don't like it. They spend much more time in the immediate nuclear family, which is not bad, although spending time with your children is really no great treat, especially for American mothers. French mothers like their children, American mothers less so. Here is a big loss. That is one of the best parts of life, is spending time with close, intimate friends and relatives. They have less of that, much less of that. They spend more time doing things they don't like doing, like housework. And they spend less time doing things they like doing, like discretionary activities. You look at the balance, this is what you'd expect. It's net, nothing. So in terms of the affective balance that you would expect from the way they use their time, you would really not expect a difference in steady state, and you don't. Okay, I could say more, but I won't. There is a medley of new findings. No. But I can tell you one thing. Republicans are a lot happier than Democrats. And that is a very significant effect, and it's a very, I think, quite an important one. And there are others like that. But now, that's more things you're not going to get to see. Where is your thing? Ah, Oh, but all of this is stuff that, oh, let me, okay.
You know, whenever I hear Danny Kahneman talk, I'm reminded of that story about the two elderly gentlemen who are leaving the Met after having seen Pavarotti, and one of them says, "What a genius, how amazing, how inspiring." And the other one says, if I had a voice like that, I could sing too. I always have this sense that, you know, this was a great talk, but if I was as smart as Danny, I could have given it. But look, seriously, happiness research was a backwater in psychology until Danny started doing it, and now it is clearly oceanfront property. His theories and research have shaped everybody's thinking on this topic, and you don't have to be a very good forecaster to predict that he will continue to set the field's agenda for decades to come. So there are three things that I'd like to say about the talk we've just heard, two of which are bravo. Now let me get to my third point. Those of us who work primarily in the lab are used to having people look at our data and say, yes, that's all very nice, but does it happen in the real world? Danny has shown us some marvelous data from the real world, so it may seem odd to you, but my question is essentially, yes, that's very nice, but does it happen in the lab? I'm actually serious. There are very good reasons to ask this question. The lab is a highly controlled artificial environment, and although we don't always know if what happens there generalizes beyond its walls, we always know what happened there. Experiments reveal the relations between variables stunningly well, even if the importance of those relationships can't always easily be judged. Research in the field is a nice complement to lab research because it has exactly the opposite quality. We know what we're seeing is happening in the real world, but we're not nearly so sure what it is we're seeing. The careful measurement that laboratories allow is important because psychology has its own version. I'm just going to turn this off because it's driving me nuts. Is this the... Because psychology has its own version of the Heisenberg dilemma, namely, it attempts to measure a person's psychological state and sometimes disrupt it, or change it, or even bring it about. I'm always surprised that economists happily teach our ideas but ignore and actually sometimes ban from their journals our experimental methods because all these fruits that psychology has are techniques for studying psychological states which sure will move the juiciest. We've developed very sophisticated ways to measure psychological states while having minimal influence on the measurable range of reaction times and psychophysiology. But some of the things we want to know about, some of the most important things require asking questions. Phenomenology is one of those. There's something it's like to be you right now, and if I want to know what that is, there's really nothing I can do short of asking. So how can you ask a person a question about their subjective state without changing it? Well, the basic rule of thumb in experimental research is that you ask simply, quickly, and once, allowing the subject to respond without doing too much thinking, and thus too much editing of the state that they're recording on. The reason for following this rule is that when you don't, when you interrogate people at length about their psychological states, make them look backwards and forwards in time, urge them to think long and hard, ask them to supply reasons behind their answers, force them to ask multiple questions that bear on each other, they begin to tell you their theories about their psychological states rather than the facts of their states. Gilbert Wilson showed us long ago that these theories are often at odds with the measurable facts. Now, Danny told us in lecture number 1 that he was an aficionado of the one question experiment, and I am too. But survey research never asks one question. Frankly, compared to laboratory research, survey researchers positively interrogate the hell out of their subjects. Now, this allows them to get a lot of measurements, but to the lab psychologist, it isn't always clear what these are measurements of. When you ask somebody to spend 90 minutes describing every aspect of their life, their finances, their relationships, and their health, and then ask them how they're feeling, they'll give you an answer, but it seems likely that that answer reflects, at least in good part, their theories about what they ought to be feeling in situations like this one. Now what? Now, you may wonder why I've spent so much of your valuable time making what is really a very small methodological point, because I'm known for many things, but being a methodological nitpicker is not one of them. In fact, I'd like to convince you that this point is actually very deep and conceptual, and it gives rise to the single most important question that research on hedonic psychology has failed to answer, and that includes the research I do too. This slide, I think, makes a nice distinction, illustrates a nice distinction made by William James between what he called the I and the me. In plain language, William James said that people have an ongoing stream of experience, and then occasionally they rise up above it and view it from on high. The experience is always there, whether they're doing it or not, but the observer of the experience trades in and out of existence. When we interrogate our subjects, we force them to rise up above their own lives and look down on those lives from on high and tell us what they see. Why does this matter? So, about a decade ago, as Danny told you, he convinced me that the only reasonable way to evaluate the goodness of a life over time was to do duration weighting. To consider that as how many minutes the person spent in different hedonic states. It took a long time to convince me, but once he did, he then played a very cruel trick by renouncing his position and leaving me to defend him. So, like Senator Kerry, Danny voted for duration weighting before he voted against it. I should tell you that he recently told me he was very glad I had to also change my mind because it was good for the world and for psychology that a smart and articulate spokesman for the wrong position. But actually, I think Danny was right before he was wrong, and here's why. We're always in some hedonic state, and we rise up above it on occasion, as William James said. And what we think while we're up there changes the very thing we're looking down on. So I may be a shameless hedonist, swimming in my Olympic-sized pool, feeling the sun on my back, and the cool water against my skin, and my hedonic state could only be described as pleasurable. Now, occasionally I jump out of the pool, I pause, and I think how damn empty my life is. And for a few minutes I feel bad. And then I get back in the pool, and I start swimming again. The fact is that most of our life is spent swimming in the stream of our experience, and just a small fraction of it is spent reflecting on it. The observer leaks in and out of existence, but mostly out. This is very counterintuitive. We think the observer is mostly present, although the observer is mostly absent. And the reason is that whenever we ask if the observer is present, the answer is yes, because only the observer asks that question. You know, the answer to the question, am I having a thought right now, is always yes, but that doesn't mean you're always having a thought. This is like the refrigerator light illusion that we all believed when we were children, right? We think it's on all the time, because every time we look, it's on. But I think work, particularly Jonathan Schooler's work on consciousness and metaconsciousness, quite convincingly shows that observers are absent much more than they themselves realize. So we have two things. We have experience and reflection on experience. And this distinction gives rise to what I said is the big question that hedonic psychology has failed to answer. The question is this: which one of these two things should I, as the architect of the human life, try to maximize? Should I maximize how I feel when I'm swimming, or how I feel when I watch myself swim? Now, obviously the answer is both. It would be great to feel good both in my life and about my life, both when I'm living it and when I'm thinking about it. But if I could only have one of these things, which should I choose? A happy life that makes me unhappy to consider, or the unhappy life whose only moment of happiness comes when I think about it? Now, Danny told you that he knows what my answer to this question is, but this is just another thing about which Professor Kahneman is speaking. The most famous answer to this question was given by John Stuart Mill, who said, of course, that it was better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Now, there are many ways to read that quote, but one way to read it is that it's better to have an unpleasant life that is meaningful upon reflection than a pleasant life that is meaningless. When Mill asked his fellow philosophers this question, they all agreed. But the problem is, Mill never asked the pig. I'm serious. This is a problem. When I ask you this question, most of you, probably, maybe all of you, agree with Mill. You tell me, yes, you would prefer an unhappy life that is meaningful on reflection to its opposite. But the reason you answer my question this way is that the question itself evokes reflection. It brings the observer online, so to speak. It causes you to rise up out of the stream of your ongoing experience and think about it. When I ask this question, I'm asking it of the observer, and he naturally chooses the life that's unhappily lived, but happily observed. This photo is taken by Socrates. Each of us is both a pig who swims in the stream of experience and a Socrates who occasionally observes the pig. But when Socrates doesn't like what he sees, he frowns, and it makes the pig sad. Until Socrates goes away, at which time the pig is happily swimming once more. Mill's question about the value of a meaningful life forces you to momentarily become Socrates, so we shouldn't be surprised that your choice of lives is the one that both Mill and Socrates would approve of. You are right now looking at your life from on high, so you naturally want the life with the best aerial view. But if I could ask a pig which life he wants, he'd certainly pick differently. If each of us is both a Socrates and a pig, then the question is whose interests we should consider when we design our lives, or when we, through social policy, design the lives of millions of other people. Now, you may say Socrates, but since my question turns you into Socrates, I find your answer neither principled nor convincing. In fact, I find it wildly self-serving. It's exactly what I expect Socrates to say. If I could somehow talk to a pig, somehow ask you a question in a way that left you in your pig-like state, I'd be equally unconvinced when you told me it's the pig who deserves the priority, because this too would be a very self-serving suggestion. Indeed, as far as I can tell, the only value-neutral way for me to decide how to design a life, my own or anyone else's, is by duration weighting. Rather than asking whether Socrates or the pig is better or more important or more deserving, which is a pointless question, by the way, given that there's never anyone there to answer it except Socrates or the pig, and both of them prefer themselves, I could simply ask this: who will use the life I design more than the other? Utilitarianism tells us we should give the most happiness to the most people. So a temporal version of that dictum would say that we should design lives that bring the most happiness to the person we are most of the time. Not to the person we value, because valuing is always from someone's point of view, from the point of view of Socrates or the point of view of the pig. To say that we should prioritize Socrates because he's a more valuable person is simply to let Socrates prioritize himself, and that's not fair to the pig. Now, because we're full-time pigs and only part-time philosophers, duration weighting will almost always benefit the pig. It'll almost always favor the pig, and I know that right now that's why you don't like this idea, because at the moment you're Socrates. But even while you're in your Socratic state right now, I can probably get you to at least glimpse the appeal of duration weighting by asking you not which life you would choose for yourself, dear Socrates, but which life you would choose for your child. Would you rather that your child have a life in which she was almost always happy, except when she reflected on her life, or would you like your child to have a life in which she was almost always unhappy, but when she reflected on it, felt content? See, suddenly duration weighting is at least a possibility you would consider, because it's hard to imagine condemning your own child to 23 hours of unhappiness every day for the sake of 1 hour of happiness. Now, then tells us that both Socrates and the pig, that is, both experience and reflection on experience, are important. Well, yes, they are important for scientists to measure, but that doesn't tell us how important they should be to the person who's designing her life, or through social policy designing the lives of millions of other people. It doesn't tell us how a person should trade one of these things against the other when it's necessary, and when it isn't often necessary. Imagine that the absolute amount of ice cream that I get determines how happy I am when I have my face in the bowl and I'm sucking up the ice cream. Okay? This depends more or less on how much ice cream I get. On the other hand, when I pause to reflect on my ice cream eating experience, I compare how much ice cream I had to how much ice cream you got. So here's the question. Should I choose a situation in which I get 10 ounces of ice cream and everyone else gets 20? Or a situation in which I get 5 ounces of ice cream but everyone else gets none? This is an example like many examples, and in everyday life in which the decisions that maximize happiness when you're having an experience are not the decisions that maximize happiness when you think about that experience. So which should be favored? To say that both of them matter is of course true, if the problem is it's just not true enough, because it doesn't answer the pressing question. Duration weighting of hedonic experience is, as far as I know, the only value-neutral way to decide. That is, the only way to choose between Socrates and a pig without letting one of them make the self-serving choice. Now, I started with a methodological nitpick, and I've ended up waist deep in philosophy and pigs, two things about which I know nothing. So let me close the circle and say what I think this all means. I'd suggest that the survey data that Danny showed us tell us a great deal about Socrates, a lot about how people feel when they're thinking about their lives. But we should be very cautious in interpreting what they tell us about the pig, about the people who usually are, and the experience we're usually having when no one is looking, including us. Survey researchers, as you know, are not stupid about all this, of course. They know there's a difference between life satisfaction and momentary affect, and that's why, as you've seen, they ask people questions about both. But what lab research suggests is that when you ask all these questions together in the context of a relatively long interview, you don't get the same answer you would have gotten if you measured momentary hedonic states less reactively as psychologists in a laboratory normally would. The experience itself that Danny was talking about does have a voice if you know how to listen. The problem is that once you wake Socrates up with an expansive list of questions about finances, relationships, and the meaning of life, he chimes in on every question, and the pig doesn't get a squeal in edgewise. Lab scientists, like me, have an admittedly bad habit of generalizing from lab results without actually checking to see how the mechanisms we demonstrate in vitro play out in vivo. Nonetheless, before we construct lies or policies based on survey data, we should first consider the possibility that they don't tell us some of the things we most want to know, and that in some cases they may even provide a misleading picture of the quality of our ongoing experience, a misleading picture of how we feel when we aren't being
You just heard an exposition of what I used to believe when I was young. But I never was as witty as that. And I never, I think, was, although I did manage to convince you, but I think I have, there are a couple of responses. The first is methodological and has to do with the nitpicking. When you do the survey right, you ask the questions about well-being first, before demographics, before anything else. And so all of this can be solved by, and we're acutely aware of order effects in surveys. So for example, in the Gallup polls, the latter question is the first question that appears. And I'm concerned about the affect questions, and they may be contaminated to some extent. We know that we're not completely wasting our time with survey questions because the determinants of the responses that people give in life evaluation and when they describe their affect are not the same. So a very important determinant of affect is how much time people report spending with other people. So we have that. Tell us the number of hours that you spent with other people yesterday. That's a powerful predictor of positive affect and a less powerful predictor of the absence of negative affect. So we know that. Income is very largely immaterial to how people feel unless they're really poor. And the differences between countries, the correlation, as I said, between the ladder of life and GDP is 0.84. Between the ladder of life and average affect over countries, it's about 0.4. And when you look at average affect in countries, it makes a lot of sense. They're telling you something about affect. I think the three most depressed countries are Armenia, Palestine, and there is a third one that is in the news and I forget now. Those are people reporting depression and sadness yesterday. So, and there are, if I'd had another half hour, I had more slides to show you. There are large differences between regions of the world in how they respond to the Socratic question and to the question about affect. Latin Americans, for example, report both more positive and more negative affect than anybody else. And so, by the way, that means that in all surveys, they look very happy because they're only asked how happy are you and not how unhappy are you, because they would answer both of these questions by strongly yes. So, but we can learn about regions of the world and the causes of affect and the causes of, the Socratic or remembering self or whatever, and they're really not the same. So I think that is worth pointing out. Now, as to the normative question, Dan he really made a good case. He almost convinced me back, but not really. And the reason is, I was, before I retired, I was in a policy school. I do think in terms of policy. And I think that offering a policy that is not responsive to the objective that people want is a non-starter as a policy prescription. And people want to be satisfied. Now, they don't think that they have to give up happiness in order to be satisfied. They want both. But what they're thinking about is ultimately satisfaction. What the politicians want is not a happy populace. The politicians want a satisfied population. And so the normative question of whether there could be a situation where different policies, one could make people more satisfied and the other could make people happier, and it's a very easy question for the politician what they will go for. So in some sense, you really cannot ignore the satisfaction question and have a study of well-being that is relevant to the real world. And that's why I sort of reluctantly, everything you say about duration waiting, I'm a great believer in duration waiting. But one thing I will add about duration waiting, this whole thing happens, I think, very quickly. And what I mean by that is the following. We've been studying thoughts that people have. So we ask people, how many times, did you worry about something? Now, here I'm going slightly beyond the data. So I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure from indirect evidence. If you ask people at the end of the day, how was your day? And you had a complete record of their momentary experience, and you had a record of the few minutes that they spent worrying about money or about their no-good child or something, you will find that the worries count at the end of the day and how people think about the day, not about their lives in general. Was it a good day? They are already strongly influenced by the quality of those thoughts. So I want to say, look, you only spent 3 minutes. And furthermore, when you look for evidence that those thoughts are affecting people's mood later, you don't find it much. It is absolutely true, as you could infer from what Dan said. People's mood is determined mainly by two things at any one time. Their personality, some people are happier than others, and the local context in which they operate, what they're doing. Are they alone? Are they with other people? Are they doing something nice? Those are the things that matter to mood. Unless you are completely in love and thinking only about that, or completely miserable and in grief and thinking only about that, your experiencing self is responding to its context. And the occasional thoughts do not, I think, change that. They do not. It's not that you had that worry and now you're no longer able to work. You had that worry and you set it aside and you go on working. And if you enjoy your work, you are in a good mood. At the end of the day, those thoughts will come back. Now, can we ignore what people say at the end of the day? I find it difficult. So I find Dan's argument compelling. That won't surprise you. I find it difficult. Okay. Thank you.
now has the prospect of achieving some of them in the next 4 or 5 years, right? It's still not the case. I mean, I would still, if I had to allocate a scarce straw, given other things being equal, favor the younger person over the older person, simply because of duration. And the fact that the older person may have had the opportunity to do things but didn't, whatever. The narrative structure has an importance in some contexts and not in others. Duration comes to the fore. My question to the other Dan was, it seems that if I were able to remove the reflective capacity from you entirely, so that you would never think about your life, if I were to retard you, for example, make you retard, you would wind up having much more duration of happiness than 23 hours when you're a kid, no hours when you're not a kid, all right? Because you would not suffer and you thought it would be life. Now, it seems that normatively your conclusion leads to, if you want to have a maximum period of duration of experience, that we should make ourselves non-reflective beings. The other aspect I find puzzling about you is when you thought about satisfying Socrates or satisfying the thing, you measured it in terms of happiness. Namely, you thought that what Socrates was getting during 1 hour of reflecting on a hard life and a beautiful life was some pleasure. But it wasn't much pleasure, it was just an hour of pleasure. And the point is that Socrates doesn't care about the pleasure he's getting from reflecting on his life. That's not the measure of the value of that period of reflection. He cares about the fact that he has a valuable life, not the fact that he's getting pleasure from reflecting on it. So in judging what you're giving to the two, you're adopting a big standard. Socrates is not measuring that hour by the pleasure he gets from reflection on his life. Those are my 2 questions.
I've just remembered an argument for duration weighting that you haven't used, and which I put in a paper that was rejected actually. But and the argument with this, people actually reject duration weighting as wrong. So you get the argument by many people, there are meaningful moments and they really count, and who cares about the other moments? Well, duration weighting is very serious, and the argument I made was the following, and you reminded me of it. We all, other things being equal, think that a life, unless it's very miserable, should be prolonged. So we care about time. Even if it doesn't improve the narrative of life, we care about time. And now, if we care about the duration of life, we should also care about the amount of time that people waste on the road commuting. That is, it's the same thing as having a life that is too short if you're wasting part of it. And so I completely, when I say I resonate to duration weighting, of course I resonate to duration weighting. And you have those arguments, and they're both very strong. In the same way that I think the problem that I raised with the Ariely example and the colostomy example, shows you I'm not going to be satisfied with any simple solution to that problem. Okay, Dan.
So the question, the first one was about if you want to be retarded. It's a loaded question because that word sounds so horrible. How about deeply engaged? When you're deeply engaged in an activity, you're not reflecting on it. You're just totally in it. It's great. You're driving, riding a bicycle, whatever it is you love to do. Do I wish that my child would be that way all the time? No. Why would I not wish to be deeply engaged in something? Is reflecting, you asked the question, I'll answer. You asked me, is reflecting valuable? And I said, well, it's valuable if it brings pleasure. You said, wait, there's things that people value other than pleasure. I don't agree with you. Because I think to say that you value things is not grounded in something psychological. Like some real measurable experience is not, it's just make up words. You say, well, you can value other things. Who values it? Oh, Socrates or the pig. Each of them has an interest. And you ground that in something that feelings or thoughts that you do.
Einstein has a beautiful paper that I really recommend to anyone who's interested in any of these things. It has a very good title, too. And the title is The Challenge of Mountaineering, ... to Utility Theory. And it's a very eloquently written piece about what it's like to climb mountains. And it's just an agonizing pain almost all the time. And then there is very little pleasure after, except that people are completely addicted to that way of life. Now, are we going to say that they're making a mistake? Because they have, we are not finding pleasure anywhere. They're out of place in the real world when they're not on the mountain, and when they are on the mountain, they're mostly suffering. And they wouldn't give it up. They're clearly addicted to that life. There is a challenge to, there is a normative problem.
George Lowenstein wrote that paper because he wanted you to know he climbed mountains. Very pleased.
So there's something I'm wondering about the role of attention, right? About whether we should care more about reflection or actual experience. And I'm wondering if there's not a way around this, right? So this necessarily happens to be in conflict. I can imagine a situation where either the king or Socrates gets re-educated. I guess it's easier to re-educate Socrates. So what if we get Socrates to value that which the king values, right? Then everybody's happy. There is no problem. We get to be able to reflect on we're happy while we're doing it. So I guess I'm wondering whether always necessarily see the closure of this work around my work, right, as a policy persuasion. Then the second thing I'm wondering about is whether the pig has sustainable happiness, right? So if the pig is left in charge of doing whatever it wants, will the pig be more happy on day two than if Socrates attempts to maximize his happiness? They would be actually more happy on day two than day three, etc., right? Also, the pig, if you're thinking about policy, right, isn't the pig going to trample over everyone else's happiness?
No, I think they're not a nice pig. I mean, that's not. That's not. I don't think that we need to be concerned.
I guess it's an objective Socrates, right? Or does Socrates standards changing the happiness?
Different people are going to want different things of their life, and they're going to have different values, and they're going to have different narratives and care about different things. Not everybody wants to climb mountains. And the question is whether we have any right, if you will, to educate them about what they should want, which of the various... there is something that I didn't mention. Just a datum, which I think is important. Emotional experience doesn't have a single axis. So there is one major axis, which is evaluation. It goes from good to bad, from pleasure to displeasure. There is another axis. It's not quite as big, but there is another axis, and it's arousal, activation. Now it turns out that the correlation between life satisfaction and pleasure is really not very high. But the correlation between life satisfaction and arousal is higher. That is, the people who are satisfied with their lives do things that impose stress on them in real time. Because stress is a high arousal. Stress and joy are both high arousal. Anxiety and so on are low arousal. Watching television is a very interesting activity from that point of view because it is sort of affectively mildly above neutral and very low arousal. And it's significantly correlated with low satisfaction with life. So there are complexities even when we look at emotions. We should, I think, not completely focus on pleasure because we know that emotion is more complex than that. Well, what there is, and I may not answer the question you asked, I'll answer a question, a slightly different question that I want to answer. There is now a whole movement of positive psychology that we haven't talked about. And I think neither Dan nor I are great fans of that movement. I know he is not, and I know pretty much that I'm not. What positive psychology has in terms of interventions, which turns out to be also what the Dalai Lama and his supporters, followers have, are procedures for redirecting your attention and making you happier by educating your attention. So the exercise of thinking of 3 happy things before you go to bed is an exercise in focusing your attention so as to give yourself pleasure. And I can't see why it could hurt. I mean, that looks just like a good thing. There may be a problem of sustaining it, you know, and I'm not sure the evidence is good that it can be sustained. But I have been thinking very hard about this because I know that I didn't used to exercise. And now I exercise physically, vigorously, 30 minutes a day. Now I watch thrillers and I get a lot of it. You know, it's fun for me. That's one of the best hours of the day. But I'm not, if a way is found to create mental exercises that redirect your attention to pleasant things, I think that will increase. That's going to be good for Socrates and for the pig, and that's in part a response to the question that you raise. And I think if there is something that is worthwhile in positive psychology, I don't think it's their theory that meaning is more important than pleasure. I put very little value on the evidence for that claim. But I think the interventions, which are not rooted in theory, they're sort of rooted in psychological common sense, are all directed at redirecting your attention, at educating your attention, and I think some of them are quite clever and could possibly work. And you probably agree with that, don't you? Actually, I know you agree because you blurbed a book that says that. I would not have blurbed it, so we're done.
I think we'll end here with time. None of you will eat bacon or pork tonight, but during the